when we forego that curiosity piece, that's where miscommunication happens. And so I think that's where the Enneagram can help us, because even if we don't know that other person's type, we can understand they probably have a motivation that is different from mine.
Welcome to the Happiness and Progress podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Craig. I'm an Emmy Award-winning journalist, international speaker, mom, wife, and you know what I like to say, just a person looking for more joy in the everyday. This is a space where you belong, not because you earned it, not because of your title, your paycheck, or number of kids you have, but just because you are human and you are good. Here we explore progress over perfection, emotional and spiritual wellness, and how to relish the good parts of life that coexist with the not so good parts. This is Happiness in Progress. Today we are talking all things Enneagram. We have Stephanie Barron Hall, Enneagram expert and author of the new book, Enneagram in Real Life: Find Your Type, Understand Who You Are, and Take Steps Toward Growth. In this conversation, we're going to do a high level, what is each type? And this is going to go beyond just the one word. For ones you might have heard in the past, these are perfectionists. She's going to talk a little bit more about motivations, desires for each type. So this is going to give you a good high-level understanding. Then later on in the conversation, we're going to talk about how this knowledge impacts our relationships, how it can impact our communication, and how it can change how we see one another just as humans. There's a lot to unpack here. I did talk a lot about which Enneagram I am, so I'm sorry about that. But let's go ahead and get into it. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I love the Enneagram. I have a million questions about the Enneagram. I think as a lot of people do. I really want to focus on how understanding the Enneagram and those around us can help our communication with the people we love most. But first, I think maybe it would be helpful to start with like a quick high level, what are the different types, so that someone listening who may not have already taken the test or hasn't done a deep dive will have a high level understanding before we have the conversation.
Sure.
So let's start there.
Sounds great. So the Enneagram is a motivation-based personality system oriented around 9 core types. And each of these types is actually kind of an archetype, right? So the reason that's helpful is we don't have to kind of check every single box within the type, but each of these types shares the same underlying motivation or the same driving force. And so that's what's really important to look at. Sometimes people might have experienced different personality systems that are more behavioral based. And if you look too much on Instagram, the Enneagram can seem very behavioral based, like, the perfectionist is the one. However, any type can be a perfectionist. So instead of using the monikers that you might be familiar with, I'll run through it with the types just as the numbers. And I'll share the motivation and kind of what the type is avoiding, because these are two driving forces that sometimes we're not even aware of. But once we start to reflect and get into the Enneagram, then we see them.
I love that, because it's very easy to be like, wait, but I am an overachiever. But that is not necessarily because I'm chasing worth, So that was my big, right. I was stuck in like this, am I a 3? Am I an 8? Am I a 3? Am I an 8? Until someone said, hey, go look at your motivation, go look at your fears. And that's when I was finally able to figure out what I was. So love that. Let's start there.
Okay, I'm excited to hear your type. When we get to yours, you can chime in.
Okay.
So first, we'll start with type 1. Just because that's simple in numerical order. Though in my book, people will notice that I don't start with type 1, and that is explained fully in the book itself. So ones are motivated by this need to be good, right, and correct. And this is not about being good at things. It's about being morally, ethically good according to their moral compass. Everyone has a different moral compass. So it's not to say that, they all do the same things, but they kind of have this ethical code that they live by. And they're avoiding being bad or corrupt. And so they set these really strong boundaries for themselves of like, this is the structure or the procedure through which I live my life. And that kind of keeps them on the straight and narrow. It's like the guardrails, so to speak. And they also fear being the last to know when they've made a mistake or when they're wrong. And so they have this really strong berating inner critic that always beats them to the punch. And so they've kind of always got that going on. I will say I have met very few people who don't have some sort of an inner critic.
Mm-hmm.
But for the type one, it's about specific things and it's kind of always there versus other types, it kind of comes and goes.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have type two, and they're motivated by a need to be loved and wanted and needed. And it's not necessarily that they, need everyone to like be their best friend, but they are about creating good relational rapport, positive relationships. They like to feel like really warm and fuzzy with everyone they know, everyone they meet. And then they tend to aim that more toward more specific people as they kind of get to know certain people. But they are avoiding being rejected or being unloved. And
Mm-hmm.
being rejected feels like I'm not lovable, I'm not loved. People are reflecting back to me that I'm kind of worthless. For two and three, the worthlessness is kind of an underpinning under the surface as well. And so twos do whatever they can to make themselves indispensable. I used to use this example and when I would teach in corporate, because that's what I do a lot. And I would say, I mentioned somebody who was a two and was a secretary and was like the most important person, very unhealthy too. And when she left, she took the Rolodex with her.
Oh my gosh.
But
That's
it
so
doesn't
funny.
work anymore because nobody knows what a Rolodex
Right.
is.
Yeah. I
But
think
that's a
everyone listening to
very,
this podcast knows. Oh, that's so funny.
such an unhealthy version of type two.
Yeah.
Not all twos are that way. That's an extreme. Then we have type three, and they're motivated by this need to be worthy and to be admirable and respectable and successful. And so
Hmm.
they believe I get worth and success by being as productive as possible, by people being impressed by me. And so they really shapeshift and they know how to connect with different people. And they can kind of like alter how they show up to be whoever they need to be in that room. And this means they can connect with a lot of different people, but they tend to have a really hard time connecting with themselves and knowing what they think and what they feel and what they value. And so they're avoiding being worthless. And this sense of worthlessness is really the fear that is driving them to achieve and to move higher and higher on that corporate ladder or the social ladder or wherever they're trying to hustle to be better.
Yeah. Very ego driven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have type four. So fours are motivated by a need to know and express their truest and most authentic identity. So they're really plumbing the depths of their psyche to get to know what else is down there. Who am I really? They have a really rich imagination, a rich interior life, and they're very emotional. So they're really good at being able to pinpoint different emotions, unlike their neighbors, the threes, who have a more difficult time with that. Now, they're avoiding being inauthentic, like maybe not being aligned with who they truly are, and being insignificant. So a lot of the time, Boris will put their own special little spin on things, just to make it theirs. It's kind of like their signature.
Yeah. You know what? So I'll give you I know I'm having you like just rattle these all off. So I'll give you a quick break. During the pandemic, I went through a small time where I was like, wait, I'm not an eight. I'm not a three. I'm a four. And I wonder if it was just like it was a very emotional time for us. And I was spending a lot of time, with myself and finding my most authentic self. Now I've decided I'm not a four, but it's said that our Enneagram doesn't change. And so
Hmm.
that's also very confusing for me because I'm like, oh, I felt very fourish then. But even like talking about, seeking worth, wanting to be lovable,
Hmm.
those are all very just human characteristics. So that I think can
Yes.
kind of get you off the track of maybe where you really belong in the Enneagram.
Yeah, they are very human, and I think a lot of us resonate with a variety of them.
Hmm.
However, what I see is that typically you've gotten some feedback that's pretty consistent, especially maybe at work throughout your life, that aligns with the type of feedback that your type would get.
Right.
So
Oh, that's
like
good.
ones hear a lot of like, wow, you are such a perfectionist that it's really holding you back, or you're really hard on yourself and it's hard for me to see you be like that. Or different things like that. And so we can kind of see those threads. And also, I think that it's important to differentiate those momentary like, wow, I'm having this crisis to like the the ongoing kind of thread throughout because we have different seasons. I think a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, now that I'm a parent, I'm a completely different person.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. But I think you can still find the threads
Okay,
of the same
we're
type.
gonna
Yeah.
get into type 5, but first I want to tell you what that made me think of was at work. I've always been a very direct person, and so my emails are like, "Hey, need this by 5." Hey, get me the document, by this deadline. And not because I'm trying to be mean. I'm just trying to be efficient. Let's get things done. I don't want to be like, hi, how's your day? Hope it's well.
Hmm.
Haven't seen you in some time. But what I learned is that people don't love that. It makes them feel a certain way when they get a one sentence email from me that ends in a period that's asking for something by a certain deadline. So
Yeah.
now I write my email that's like, hey, need this by 5. And then I'm like, oh, let's add some things. And so I go back and I'm like, hope you're doing well today.
Yeah.
Would
Add
love
some
to see
flowers
this
in
by
there.
5 if we can.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that I'm getting so off track because we haven't even gone through 5 through 8. But that's why understanding how everyone communicates differently and how they perceive your communication matters so much. So let's get to type 5.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the communication piece is one of my favorite things to talk about for this reason. So, fives are motivated by this need to be competent and self sufficient. And the way that they achieve that is by decreasing what they need from the world and really finding a lot of their own internal resources. So, they like to read and learn and research as much as they possibly can. And they are really afraid of and really strongly avoiding being depleted. So, it's as if they have a specific amount of battery when they wake up every morning and they have thought through their day and they know how much battery they can dedicate to each thing so that they still will have enough at the end of the day to then go back and like isolate and think through things and process and all of that stuff. And so they are really taking a lot of care to preserve their mental, emotional energy, their time, their resources, whatever that might mean for them. And so they tend to be very cerebral. They really like data and objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
facts, and that's kind of what they go after. So they don't like living by emotions like their neighbors, the fours. They are very much about like what is the cold hard fact here, and the data, and create margin in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So sixes are motivated by this need to find security and safety, but ultimately what they're after is certainty. They don't want to feel uncertain. And certainty is elusive because it's like perfection. The closer you get, the further away that it is. And so sixes do a couple of different things. Some sixes, when they're faced with uncertainty or fear, they escape that feeling of fear because they don't want to feel fear, right? Even though sixes are known for kind of being afraid all the time, it's more that they don't want to feel afraid. So they do different things to mitigate that. And some sixes, they plan, they problem solve, they mentally process, they, build alliances with other people to say, I have strength in numbers, I'm with these people. I had one six in a session one time. She said at the end of every day, she would lay down and instead of, theoretically like counting sheep or something, she would process through everything that could go wrong and how she would fix it or how she
Oh
would
my
deal with it.
gosh. Yeah. Wow.
And that calmed her. And then other sixes, they see that fear and they try to kind of scare it off. Um, so they might be somebody who's afraid of heights and go skydiving. And that example sounds trite, but I have heard it so many times in actual sessions with sixes who say, oh, yeah, I do that.
Oh my goodness. That's so amazing. That's funny. I just, I don't know. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, which that sounds like me. In fact, I was making a 40 before 40 list and I was like, you know what? I am going to get rid of this fear for good. I'm going skydiving and then I'll stop being afraid of the world. But I've
Yeah.
never resonated with a 6 except for in this very conversation. And I've never
Hmm.
gotten a 6 on any test. So
Yeah.
Who
Well,
knows?
so those sixes that are like kind of, they try to scare off the fear, they typically seem like eights externally,
Interesting. Okay.
though there always is the overlay. So, like, if you have OCD and then you have, and then you're whatever type, because any type could have OCD,
Right.
you're going to have certain characteristics, but it might not be the same motivation.
Yeah.
If that
Right.
makes sense.
So it all comes
So,
back to the motivation.
yeah. So these types are, they're avoiding being kind of stranded in the sense of like, I went out on my own and or I stuck my neck out and I was big and bold and brave and now I'm alone and you know the worst thing is happening. So really their fear is the worst case scenario coming to fruition.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we have sevens who are
I love
motivated by this
sevens.
need. Yeah, they're really fun. And they want to be free to explore the world that is full of possibilities. And they just believe anything is possible. And a lot of the time, things work out for them because they believed it was possible and they didn't think about what might go wrong. And so they made it happen. And so their fear is being trapped in pain or boredom. And really, boredom feels physically painful for a lot of sevens. So they're always going, always running, always doing the next thing. And they seem like they're just about fun and enthusiasm on the outside, but they're actually about mental stimulation. So they always want to have something interesting to think about or some mental puzzle that they can solve.
Okay. Sounds like a lot of people I know. Sounds a little bit
Yeah.
like me again. Um, all right, let's hear eight, and then this is the very moment I'll decide for sure. No,
Yeah.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So eights are motivated by a need to be against. And it's not to be against just to be contrarian for contrarian's sake. It's kind of like they have this need to protect themselves. And so they need a tough exterior to make sure that nobody can push them over or control them or take advantage of them. They really want to avoid being vulnerable because vulnerability leaves them open to betrayal and being harmed, controlled, or otherwise, taken over by somebody else. And so for eights, it's all about control. They're a very grounded person. And it's not about controlling other people, but they just don't want other people controlling them. So eights tend to be very direct, and almost abrasive in some sense. And I will say one thing that's different between sixes and eights is while they're both pragmatic, eights are a lot more grounded. They don't really deal in abstractions as much. Sixes
Black and
are
white.
very
Yep.
mental types.
Hmm.
Sixes like to kind of like puzzle things and model things and then process them. And they have more of that mental modeling whereas eights are more like, this is what it is.
Yep. Yep. There we go. It's settled. It's an eight.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
all came down for me. And I think on this podcast, a lot of the people that I've especially at live events that I've met, I think I have a lot of twos listening, a lot of ones listening, a lot of nines listening. And so I want to make sure they get what they need in this conversation. But when it comes to the eight, how I finally determined, I think I'm an eight more than a three is because of that control.
Mhm.
That's when I, have a lot of anxiety. That's when I feel unsteady is when I have a lack of control. And
Yeah.
I've been working very hard on vulnerability over the last like since 2017. And every time I'm vulnerable on anything on social media, I'll do it a lot. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, because it opens me up for anybody can come and say whatever they want about me now. And I've lost control of my own story and my own life. And it's hard, but I think there's been a lot of growth in trying to, get out of
Yeah.
maybe what is my inclination.
Talk about nines really quick. So nines are motivated by this need to be at peace internally and externally. And they really like to have calm, comfort, steadiness. They want kind of everything to feel like good, like it's at equilibrium. And some of the things that can happen that make them feel out of sorts are like disagreeing or having a different opinion from somebody around them. Sometimes even experiencing, oh, I disagree with this person, internally can feel like conflict, and they don't want that. And so they really value their relationships and often will kind of merge with other people and they'll kind of think, ah, my opinions or my desires or whatever I think, it's like not that important, or I don't hold it that strongly. So whatever they say goes, that's totally fine.
Mhm.
But nines actually do have opinions. And so, sometimes when you try to run over them or try to assume that they're really easygoing, that's when you'll find their stubborn streak,
Mhm.
which I appreciate. Sometimes nines don't like it when I point that out, though.
They'll like
Um,
lean a little bit into their eight wing.
yeah. So they are also avoiding being the cause of discord or disconnection. And so they kind of believe like if I stand up for myself or if I voice this opinion, like it's going to cause a rift in this relationship, and I just rather not risk it.
Mm.
And so they prioritize the relationship over their own perspective. Yeah, so that's type nine.
There we go. So we have 1 through 9. Why is it important when it comes to our relationships that we kind of have a general understanding of this when we're communicating with the people that we love or the people that we work with or that we just, come into contact with?
Yeah. So I think we all try to not apply our own motivation to other people's behavior. We try to do that. We try to be emotionally mature people and not do that. Um, but that is not always how it happens. So, for example, if I'm the type of person who gets really quiet when I'm angry, which I'm not that type of person, but just let's imagine, then when I go into a work meeting and my colleague is quiet, maybe they have their arms crossed even, or maybe they're just sitting back and they're not saying much, I might start to think, oh, they must be angry. So I'm applying my motivation to their behavior. And then I interact with them after the meeting and I may be a little bit more short or a little bit more defensive because I'm already on edge because I'm thinking, oh no, they're angry. So I have to tiptoe. And instead, we could be curious and instead of applying our motivation to their behavior, be curious about their motivation. And we might discover, oh, they are mad or they're tired or they're feeling sick or they've got something going on at home or they're just listening. So many other possibilities. And so when we forego that curiosity piece, that's where miscommunication happens. And so I think that's where the Enneagram can help us because even if we don't know that other person's type, we can understand they probably have a motivation that is different from mine. So I can be curious in interacting with them instead of jumping to these conclusions that are going to kind of make everything go sideways.
Right. Oh my goodness. I love that. Not jumping to the conclusions. In the book, you talk about how each Enneagram has a different threshold. And I
hmm
loved that. I hadn't heard about that before. Tell me about that first time you realized you had that aha moment. Oh, we're all operating on different thresholds.
Yeah. So I was working with a team and I this this team they all were most of them were eights. And they were having this problem where other people within the organization kind of perceived them as intimidating and had a difficult time communicating with them. And so they kind of had this liaison who happened to be a nine who was like fielding a lot of these conversations and was like, I mean, that's not how they are, but like, this is the feedback that I'm constantly getting.
Hmm.
And so this what came to me is like, oh, eights have a different threshold for what feels like conflict. So in this example, one of the team members was having a conversation, an animated conversation after a meeting with a couple of other people in the conference room, and then he was like, "Okay, great conversation." He left, and then he later saw that person crying, and he was so confused because he was like, "What just happened? I thought we had a great conversation."
Yeah.
So if you're listening, you can imagine eights have a high threshold for what feels like conflict. Imagine I'm kind of putting my hand up above my eyebrows, and not other types have a low threshold for what feels like conflict. So like think about shoulder height. If the conversation happens between that threshold, say right in the middle, the eight walks away thinking, we just had a great conversation. And the other type walks away thinking, uh-oh, we're in a fight. And each of the types has a different threshold, not necessarily in this conflict realm, but in different ways. Has these, we all have these different thresholds, and we get tripped up and triggered by different things that we think are kind of mutual among everyone, but actually aren't. And
Mm-hmm.
this is one of the ways that we can understand ourselves and understand our coworkers, our partners, etc.
Yeah, I think it's so important to have that understanding for yourself because then when you show up with that to that conversation, you can communicate in a way that will be better received by other people. I also, as you're talking, I'm thinking in a marriage, especially, or a relationship, a partnership, how difficult that is to come together with everything that's different about us, our past and our love language and everything. And then we also have a different way that we communicate. What are some of the others that have come up? Maybe more often than others. These different thresholds.
Yeah, so I think for type three, so I'm type three, and one of the ones that comes up for me is having a different threshold for like what feels worth celebrating. So, for
Mm,
example, um, for years, I was like, you know what? Someday I'm going to run a half marathon. Both of my sisters had done it. I was like, oh, that's such like a high bar. I don't know if I could ever really do that. And then I did it. I ran a half marathon and I was like, it's like not that big of a deal.
just 13 miles.
Right. So I immediately like minimized it
Yeah.
after doing it. And it's kind of this thing that threes do where the bar is always moving and it doesn't feel like I can celebrate until I get to this bar. But then once I get to that bar, I move the bar again, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so different types, like for example, sevens have a low threshold for what feels like worth celebrating. Like I have seven friends who, anytime we get together, they're like, "What are we celebrating today?" "Oh, you got your nails painted and they look great. Let's celebrate." Like, and not that they're frivolous about things. They're just like, let's enjoy life,
Yeah.
Let's
Mm-hmm.
prioritize having a good time and enjoying the things that are right in front of us. And so that's one of those ways that we can really differ and we can balance each other out and see each other differently.
I think that helps us grow as well. You know, a three in that situation can grow by saying, wait, my half marathon is worth celebrating. This is a big
Mhm.
deal. I spent a lot of time to do this. If my nails are worth celebrating.
Yep. Yep.
What about for twos? Let's go to
Mhm.
twos. What is their maybe threshold disconnect with others?
Yeah. So one of them is twos really have this concentration on how much is enough that they can do for other people. So ones, twos, and threes think about what is enough a lot. And they really are like over responsible and they push themselves too hard. But twos often think that they're not doing enough in terms of like helping other people or providing for other people, and often will go above and beyond. And they don't really consider like, is this even like appropriate, or should I just spend my time focusing on what I need or what I want?
Mm-hmm.
And so they kind of have that threshold that says, above this line is that's enough. Anything below it, I could still be doing more to support this other person. And I think that can be challenging because twos can exhaust themselves and they make themselves really resentful because they one of the one of the twos I interviewed 30 people for the book because I really
Mm-hmm.
wanted to get, their perspectives. And one of the twos I interviewed said he would write blank checks that he couldn't cash in the sense of like anytime he did something for somebody else, he was like, all right, I got that in the bank. Now, when I need that back, they're going to give it back. Right.
Yeah.
So, but they didn't know that he was expecting, this big favor in return.
Yeah.
And he didn't realize that he was like kind of weighing everything like, okay, you know, I did this for them. Now they owe me.
Yeah.
He didn't realize that he was even expecting that of other people. And it led to a lot of resentment and burnout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking that would be so hard, even if you're consciously not waiting for them to pay you back. You're wondering, why do I do so much for all of these people and no one ever helps me when I need help? That's a
Mhm.
very hard and resentful place to be. As you've interviewed all of these people, how many people did you say it was?
30.
That's amazing. What have you learned about maybe just like humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways we're all kind of more similar than we think, and more different. Like, so I'll talk about both, but more similar in the sense that all of us want love and care and community support and kindness and to have our basic needs met. Now, what will meet those needs? That's where we differ, right? So sometimes I'll be talking to somebody who, and I should say, these 30 interviews were specifically for the book, and they were specifically like I chose people really intentionally from different countries, different genders, different orientations, class, ages, like all these different things. So, and they were all 27 subtypes. But I've done hundreds of typing interviews over the years as well, where I sit down and talk with somebody and ask them about their type and that sort of thing. And I think there are times when I'm like, wow, it never would occur to me to make that assumption that
Mm.
this person really takes for granted. And it helps me to see, oh, I have all these assumptions that I think that
Yeah,
everyone else has too.
that's so powerful. That totally changes how you communicate with people.
Right. And I think it's helpful too because just in that example we were talking about with twos, to me, I think, well, that was their prerogative if they wanted to help me with that or not. They could have said no.
Hmm.
So I don't owe them anything.
Right.
And if they need help, I will absolutely help if I have capacity and I'm available and I want to. But like I don't quote unquote owe them. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's been helpful even in my friendships to be like, oh, like let me kind of reframe this or to really say no. Like because if I know it's a person that's going to expect something back from me and I don't have capacity to give that back at that time, then I might be like, thank you so much. And no, thank you. I would not like
Yeah.
that help.
Sometimes I think that's helpful. I have a loved one who's a two, and I'll just say, you are doing so much. I love you. I don't need this, but you still matter. You're still like the most important person in my life, but I don't need you to pop in and do this. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think it is that perception of, um, or not the perception, but it is that piece about what meets our needs and like those assumptions that we make.
mm,
And I walk into a room and you know, I was just thinking about sixes, for example. They have like all of these things and all of these like checklists in their minds that they're going through, and it's so different from how I process things, and it's so different from how I think. So that can be really valuable if I let it be, or it can be really annoying.
yeah. Yeah.
And so being able to understand these different perspectives is so helpful because I can then hopefully see more of the value than be annoyed by it.
All right. Well, I wish we could keep going. I would love to talk about this forever. I am now going to go back and double check that I'm not a six, and then maybe in the end I'm a three because I because I shapeshift from one to the other. Who knows? But the last question that I ask everybody is, what is your number one tip to finding more joy in the good, the bad, and the in between?
I think that I am happiest and most joyful when I lean into curiosity and just like look up, whether that's walking around the area where I live, which, there's tons of big, beautiful trees, especially in the fall. It's really nice. But like how many times am I just like looking at my feet or looking at my phone or something else? So like looking up and being curious, I think leads to a lot more joy and interest and fascination.
Mhm. I love that. I love the example of doing that just as you're walking. But as you talked about earlier, that curiosity can help so many miscommunications. So love that. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I wanted to get to so much more, but just going over the first nine, it takes time. So that's okay.
Yep.
I will link your book. And so everyone can go grab a copy of that and follow you on Instagram for a whole bunch more knowledge. Okay, hop over to show notes. There you will find so much information if you want to take a test, if you want to figure out which Enneagram you are, if you want to follow Stephanie, a lot more information there. Her link to her brand new book is also there if you want a copy of that so you can delve more into this. There is a lot here 30 minutes is not enough for the Enneagram talk, but I want to thank you all for being here on Happiness in Progress.